The moment Judge Judy pointed her finger at Jasmine Crockett and accused her of dividing America, the room held its breath. But no one expected what happened next. Crockett didn't explode. She didn't retreat. Instead, with just a few calm words, she flipped the entire panel and forced everyone to see the truth they'd been avoiding. The tension in the room could be felt before a single word was spoken. It was the kind of panel discussion that brings together bold personalities, strong voices from law, politics, and public opinion meant to discuss the future of America's unity. But what started as a conversation quickly turned into a sharp confrontation, and no one expected it to come from Judge Judy herself, known for her no-nonsense attitude and decades of courtroom authority. Judge Judy has built a reputation on cutting through drama and getting straight to the point, so when she turned her focus toward Representative Jasmine Crockett, it was clear something was about to go down. "You're not helping this country," Judge Judy said bluntly, looking Crockett square in the eye. "You're dividing it. Every time you speak, it feels like you're fanning the flames instead of cooling things down." The room froze. Panelists, audience members, and even the host paused, unsure how to react. Crockett, however, didn't flinch. She didn't raise an eyebrow or shift in her seat. She didn't jump in to interrupt or push back. She simply stared ahead, calm as ever. There was something deeply unsettling about the silence that followed. It wasn't the kind of silence that meant someone was caught off guard. It was the kind that meant something important was about to be said. "I respect your years in the courtroom," Crockett finally said, her voice level and steady. "But you're wrong about me." No raised voice, no outrage, just control, clarity, power. Everyone leaned in. Judge Judy wasn't expecting that kind of composure. She had likely expected a rebuttal full of fire, maybe even some finger-pointing or political deflection. But what she got was the exact opposite, a cold, calm mirror held up to her assumptions. From the moment Jasmine Crockett opened her mouth, she shifted the dynamic. What had started as an attack became a challenge not to her, but to the very narrative that was being used against her. "You see division when I speak," she said, "but I see reflection. If the country feels shaken when someone like me tells the truth, maybe the problem isn't what I'm saying, maybe the problem is how long it's been ignored." Now the panelists were really listening. You could almost feel the energy change. What began as a head-on collision was slowly turning into something else, a moment of forced reflection. Judge Judy, still firm in her expression, seemed to study Crockett more closely. Her posture remained upright, but her eyes had narrowed, as if re-evaluating what she thought she knew. Crockett continued, "I'm not here to make people comfortable. I'm not here to smooth over cracks in a system that's broken for too many. I'm here to speak for the people who never get invited to conversations like this, people who are told to stay quiet and be polite while they suffer." It was a quiet mic drop. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't try to outshine anyone, but her words carried more weight than anything else said in the room so far. And that's when the room realized something important. Crockett wasn't arguing. She was revealing. Judge Judy's accusation that Crockett was dividing the nation suddenly felt less like a powerful statement and more like a misunderstanding. Crockett wasn't setting fires. She was pointing to the ones already burning. The silence returned, but this time it wasn't awkward. It was thoughtful. The host tried to move the conversation forward, but even they hesitated, sensing the moment still had more to give. The panel wasn't just watching a political figure respond to criticism, they were watching a leader choose substance over show. And that, more than anything, made an impact. By the end of that segment it was clear. Something had shifted, not because of shouting, not because of spectacle, but because Crockett had shown that sometimes the most powerful response isn't the loudest one. It's the one that holds its ground without trembling. After Jasmine Crockett's quiet but cutting first response, the tone in the room was no longer tense, it was transformed. What had started as a direct accusation from Judge Judy was slowly unraveling into something far more important. A moment of reckoning. Judge Judy, arms crossed and expression stern, waited for a reaction, maybe even expected Crockett to lose her cool or throw the accusation back. But instead, Crockett did something few people manage in a heated moment. She stayed completely in control, and that control carried power. "I speak for people who don't get to sit at tables like this," Crockett continued, her voice low but unwavering. "People who are told their frustration is offensive, who are told to calm down when they speak up, who are labeled divisive when they demand fairness." She paused just long enough for the message to sink in. "You call it division," she said softly, "but what you're really hearing is discomfort. Discomfort with voices that were never supposed to be loud in the first place." Now the panel wasn't just listening, they were absorbing. One panelist, a political analyst seated 2 chairs away, shifted uncomfortably in their seat. Another, a former mayor, glanced down at their notes but didn't say a word. Crockett wasn't just defending herself anymore. She was challenging an entire narrative that had long been accepted in rooms like this. "There's a pattern we've seen for years," Crockett said. "When people on the margins rise up, speak clearly, and ask hard questions, they get labeled as the problem. Suddenly it's them creating chaos. Not the system, not the silence, but the people who dare to speak." She wasn't yelling, she wasn't emotional, and that made it all the more impactful. Even Judge Judy, known for her quick rebuttals and no patience attitude, didn't jump back in right away. Instead, she stared directly at Crockett, measuring her, testing her words, and quietly, something shifted in her posture. Not weakness, not agreement, but recognition. Crockett used the moment. Judge, you spent your life fighting for justice in your courtroom. You've seen people at their worst and tried to bring order. But justice can't only exist in the courtroom. It has to live out here too. And out here, people like me were not trying to create division. We're trying to expose what was always there. It was hard to argue with that. Another panelist spoke up slowly, cautiously. But do you think your tone sometimes alienates people, that maybe the message gets lost in how it's delivered? Crockett didn't flinch. Isn't it interesting? She replied. How often we ask the oppressed to be polite while we ignore what's hurting them. We want the message, but we don't want the emotion. We want the truth, but only if it's gentle. That hit hard. Even the audience, silent up to this point, gave an audible hum of agreement. Someone nodded. Another leaned forward. Crockett had taken a seat on the defensive and turned it into the strongest position in the room. At that moment, the label of divisive no longer stuck to her. She wasn't being difficult. She was being direct. And the panel was starting to realize that maybe, just maybe, they hadn't been listening as closely as they thought. She closed the moment with this. I'm not here to comfort the powerful. I'm here to give voice to the unheard. And if that makes some people uncomfortable, then maybe that's where change begins. Silence followed, not the kind that demands someone fill it, but the kind that makes people reflect. A heavy, thoughtful silence. Judge Judy finally spoke, but it wasn't an attack. So what's the goal then? She asked. If not division, what is it? Crockett looked directly at her and answered without hesitation. Accountability. That's what I want. Not just for one side, for every side. The tide had turned, completely. What began as a sharp accusation against Crockett had become an opportunity for her to lead the conversation, and she had done so not with fire, but with poise, not with slogans, but with truth. By this point, the atmosphere in the room had completely transformed. Judge Judy's opening accusation had started strong, sharp, and confident, but Jasmine Crockett's calm, pointed response had disarmed not just the attack, but the assumptions behind it. And as the room began to absorb her words, something quietly remarkable began to happen. Other panelists, who had initially stayed silent or aligned with Judge Judy's stance, started to reconsider their positions. The first to break the silence was a retired judge seated at the far end of the table, someone who had worked with Judge Judy years ago and often agreed with her tough love approach. That's fair, he said softly, tapping his pen on the table. We talk a lot about division, but we don't always talk about why people feel so far apart. Maybe it's not the voices we're hearing, maybe it's the ones we haven't heard in too long. It was a quiet concession, but a meaningful one, and it set off a chain reaction. Another panelist, a conservative columnist known for her sharp critiques of progressive voices, chimed in next. Her tone was still cautious, but no longer dismissive. I've disagreed with Congresswoman Crockett many times, she admitted, but I'll say this, I've rarely heard her speak this clearly about her deeper intentions. If this is what she stands for, I can at least respect the consistency. Jasmine Crockett didn't gloat. She didn't smile or nod. She simply listened, just as she had asked others to do earlier. That in itself said more than any words could. Judge Judy, always sharp and never one to back down easily, finally leaned forward. Her tone had softened, just slightly. So what's the solution then? She asked. You've made your point. You've explained your side, but how do we actually fix this? How do we bring people together without lighting more fires along the way? It wasn't a challenge anymore. It was a question, a genuine one. And Crockett didn't miss a beat. We stop pretending unity means silence, she said clearly. We stop asking people to ignore their pain just so others can feel comfortable. Unity doesn't mean pretending everything is okay. It means facing the hard truths together even when they sting. She took a breath, letting that message hang. Too often, she continued, we want peace before justice, but peace without justice is just quiet oppression. I don't want chaos, I want healing. But you can't heal what you refuse to feel. The room was now completely still. Even the host had set down their notes and stopped trying to steer the conversation. This moment had taken on a life of its own, and everyone was just trying to keep up with it. One of the youngest panelists, a sociologist known for studying political behavior, spoke next. That's the part we miss, she said, turning toward Judge Judy. People don't want to be divided, but they also don't want to be ignored. And sometimes, voices like Crockett's force us to confront the things we've conveniently avoided. There was no more debate, not because everyone now agreed, but because Crockett had reframed the issue entirely. The discussion had begun with a charge. You are dividing America. But now, it had evolved into a deeper conversation about responsibility, perspective, and truth. Crockett had not just responded to criticism. She had shifted the direction of the entire dialogue. Even Judge Judy, who had started the moment with fire and force, now looked thoughtful, not defeated but contemplative. She nodded once, slowly. I don't like your methods, she said, but I hear your intent. That was as close to an acknowledgement as anyone would expect from a figure like her. And yet, it was enough. Because this moment wasn't about scoring points. It wasn't about who won the argument. It was about something far more rare in public. Debate, reflection. As Crockett closed her remarks for the segment, she looked directly across the table. America doesn't fall apart because people raise their voices. It falls apart when we stop listening. If we can talk like this, even when it's uncomfortable, then maybe there's still hope we can fix what's broken. And with that, the conversation moved forward. But the tone had been reset. The energy had shifted. And the room, once thick with tension, now felt filled with something else. Respect. The temperature in the room had cooled, not from avoidance, but from understanding. What began as a spark of confrontation had evolved into a deeper, more honest conversation. And in that rare space, where egos step back and ideas take the lead, reflection began to replace debate. For once, no one was speaking just to win, they were listening. Even Judge Judy, sharp-eyed and famously blunt, appeared less rigid in her seat. Her tone was still firm, but it had shifted, no longer confrontational, now contemplative. "You're not wrong that people feel unheard," she said. "I've seen what it looks like when people are crushed by the system. But I've also seen what happens when anger controls the message. It scares people," Crockett responded, this time with a softer voice, not out of retreat, but empathy. "And I've seen what happens when people bury their anger too deep. It becomes silence, it becomes hopelessness, it becomes surrender." She didn't say this to provoke. She said it because she believed it. "There's a difference," she added, "between destructive rage and righteous truth. One burns everything. The other clears the way for something new." The older judge, who had earlier agreed with Crockett, nodded quietly. "I think what we're seeing here," he said, "is the cost of years, even generations of people, feeling like justice was only for the lucky, the wealthy, or the powerful. You can't ignore that and then act surprised when someone speaks with urgency." What had begun as an attack on Crockett for dividing the country had turned into something far more meaningful. A shared realization that what feels like division is sometimes just long overdue honesty. The conservative columnist, still not fully agreeing, took a different route. "I don't agree with everything you've said today, Congresswoman," she began, "but I will say this. I came in expecting the usual political sparring. What you gave us was something else." Crockett gave a small nod. "I don't come into spaces like this to perform. I come because I believe we have to start getting real, even if it's uncomfortable, especially if it's uncomfortable." And then she said something that settled over the entire room like a quiet truth. Real unity only happens when the truth is laid bare, not hidden under smiles, not wrapped in politeness, but spoken, even when it stings. Those words were not loud, but they echoed. Even the host, who had remained largely quiet throughout this emotionally charged exchange, finally spoke. "This might be one of the most honest moments we've had at this table," they said. "Not because everyone agrees, clearly they don't, but because no one's pretending." That comment captured the essence of what was unfolding. There was no pretense anymore. No rehearsed sound bites or forced applause lines. Just raw conversation. And it was in that honesty that something rare happened. Growth. Judge Judy wasn't suddenly in full agreement with Crockett, and she didn't need to be. What mattered was that she listened. Truly listened. And for someone who had spent a lifetime commanding order in courtrooms, it meant something to the audience watching, to see her pause and consider, rather than strike back. "I still think there's a way to speak that invites people in," she said carefully. "But maybe I also need to accept that the room isn't always as welcoming as I'd like to believe." Crockett smiled, not with pride, but with gratitude. "That's all I ever ask," she said. "Not to agree with me, just to acknowledge that there's more than one truth living in this country, and they all deserve to be heard." In that moment, the conversation no longer belonged to just the panel. It belonged to everyone watching, to every person who had felt misunderstood, to every voice told to quiet down, to every frustrated listener who wanted not just sides but solutions. And through Crockett's words, and Judy's willingness to stay present in the discomfort, the conversation evolved from confrontation to connection. For once, the debate wasn't about who got the last word. It was about what kind of country we want to be. One that silences hard truths in favor of comfort, or one that faces those truths and grows stronger because of them. As the discussion moved forward, the room no longer felt like a battleground. It felt like a classroom, but not the kind filled with textbooks and lectures. This was a classroom of lived experiences, clashing perspectives, and hard-earned wisdom. And Jasmine Crockett, without raising her voice or demanding control, had quietly become the teacher. Her message had not been polished for applause or tailored to please. It was rooted in the reality she lived and the people she represented. Every sentence she spoke was not just a defense of her beliefs. It was a window into the lives of those who rarely get the chance to speak in rooms like the one she sat in. Judge Judy, who had launched the entire confrontation with a direct accusation, had not completely changed her position, but she had done something far more important. She had opened herself to reconsideration. In a world where many people speak only to be right, Judy was listening to understand. The power of Crockett's approach wasn't in dominance, it was in discipline. She didn't let herself be dragged into a shouting match. She didn't play to the audience. She didn't try to shame anyone. She simply stayed grounded in truth, her truth, and let it do the work. That left a deep impression, not just on the panel, but on everyone watching. The audience, whether present in the room or viewing from elsewhere, saw something rare, a real-time transformation, not just of a conversation, but of perception. One panelist who had said very little throughout the discussion finally spoke as the segment came to an end. "I came here today expecting a lot of talking past each other," he admitted. "What I saw instead was what happens when people speak to each other, and I've got to say I'm leaving this room thinking a little differently than I did when I came in." Crockett turned toward him and replied gently, "That's all I ever hoped for, not to win, just to be heard." That statement lingered in the room. In political spaces, especially those dominated by commentary, finger-pointing, and competing egos, being heard is often confused with being loud. But Crockett proved the opposite. She showed that when words come from clarity and calm conviction, they echo far longer than the loudest shout. Judge Judy leaned back in her seat, still composed, still sharp but changed, not defeated. That wasn't her nature but moved, and that was enough. Even her critics would admit, it takes a strong person to challenge others, but an even stronger one to allow their own perspective to be challenged in return. As the panel wrapped up, Crockett left the table with her head high, not because she had won a debate, but because she had stayed true to herself. She had taken the sharpest accusation thrown at her that she was dividing the country and turned it inside out, showing that what many call division is actually the result of refusing to face hard truths. And that's what made her stand out. She didn't let the moment define her, she defined the moment. Her final words were simple, but they hit like a quiet drumbeat. America doesn't get better by pretending it's already fine. It gets better when we're honest, even if that honesty is hard to hear. That sentiment became the lasting impression of the entire conversation. The panelists left, the cameras cooled down, but something had shifted. This wasn't a moment people would forget quickly. It would be revisited in conversations at dinner tables, in classrooms, in circles of friends who watched and said, "Did you hear how she handled that?" And that's the power of presence. Jasmine Crockett didn't just defend herself, she made people reflect on their assumptions. She took heat and turned it into light. She showed what grace under fire looks like in real time. In the end, the conversation wasn't about one woman versus another. It wasn't about two powerful voices clashing. It was about the strength of calm conviction in the face of criticism and how a well-placed truth, delivered with control, can reshape the entire tone of a room.